The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over Maple Street as the bustle of Brighton's city center drifted down the block. Officer Gary Lewis sat in his patrol car, finishing off the last sip of his coffee, savoring the moment of quiet before his shift would draw him back into the city's pulse. He had long convinced himself that the badge on his chest allowed him a certain authority over people, and he wore that entitlement with a smug satisfaction. He was the kind of officer who rarely let a moment slip by without reminding others who was in charge. But today, his hunger for control was about to lead him into a situation he'd regret for the rest of his life. Across the street, a black man in a sleek dark suit stepped out of a cafe, his every movement poised and self-assured. His name was Jordan Mason, a name few knew in Brighton now, though the city had once been his home. Confident but quiet man, Jordan had spent years building a successful career in law enforcement in another city. Unknown to everyone here, he had recently been promoted and assigned to Brighton's very own precinct as their new captain, a position that demanded both strength and grace, qualities Jordan carried effortlessly. Gary's eyes locked onto Jordan the moment he saw him, the easy confidence in the man's stride catching his attention and irritation. He didn't like the way Jordan walked, as if he belonged here, as if he didn't need anyone's approval. Without warning, Gary abandoned his half-empty coffee cup, stepped out of his patrol car, and let the door slam behind him. He stalked across the street with a look of irritated determination, like a predator zeroing in on prey. "Hey, you!" he barked, loud enough to turn heads. Jordan stopped, meeting Gary's gaze with calm but questioning eyes. Gary took a step closer, setting himself in Jordan's path. "What are you doing around here?" he demanded, his tone dripping with hostility, the kind of hostility meant to force compliance. Jordan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I'm just on my way to a meeting," he replied, his voice steady, his eyes steady. Jordan had encountered men like Gary before, men who wielded their authority like a weapon. But he also knew when to keep his cool. But Gary had no interest in the answer. To him, the calm in Jordan's demeanor was infuriating, a challenge he was unwilling to ignore. He leaned in closer, his voice low but threatening. "You look like you're up to no good," he sneered, his eyes narrowing as he demanded. "Got any ID?" Jordan moved slowly, reaching into his jacket pocket, taking care to make his movements clear and unthreatening. "I'd be happy to show you my ID, officer," he said evenly, his tone respectful but firm. Gary's jaw tightened. He didn't like Jordan's tone. It was too controlled, too composed. To him, it sounded defiant. Before Jordan could pull out his wallet, Gary's patience snapped. Fury clouded his judgment, and without warning, he grabbed Jordan by the arm, his grip rough and forceful. "You think you can talk to me like you're some big shot?" Gary growled, his face twisted in anger, and before Jordan could respond, Gary's fist flew, connecting squarely with Jordan's face, the force of the blow sending Jordan stumbling back a few steps. Everything happened so fast that the few passers-by who witnessed the confrontation stood frozen in shock. Some looked at each other in disbelief, their eyes wide with horror as Jordan steadied himself, his hand instinctively reaching for his cheek where Gary's fist had struck. Jordan's eyes met Gary's once more, and this time, they were filled with something far different than before, a steely, unbreakable resolve. For a brief, tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Jordan straightened, standing tall, his voice calm but unmistakably commanding. "You just made a big mistake, officer," he said, his words slow and deliberate. Gary scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh yeah? And what mistake is that, buddy?" he mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. Jordan took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Gary's. "I'm Captain Jordan Mason," he stated, his voice unwavering, "the new captain of this precinct." For a second, Gary's face went blank, his eyes widening as the realization hit him. The man he had just punched, the man he had tried to humiliate, was his new commanding officer. For a heartbeat, Officer Gary Lewis just stood there, frozen, unable to process the words that had left Jordan's mouth. The new captain? His mind reeled, stumbling over the reality unfolding before him. The smug confidence that had burned in his chest moments before had turned to ice, chilling him to his core. As the seconds ticked by, Jordan Mason continued to hold Gary's gaze, calm but unyielding, his eyes unwavering and full of quiet authority. The stunned onlookers around them began murmuring, pulling out their phones, capturing the moment as they realized the gravity of what they were witnessing. Gary's mouth went dry. He tried to summon his usual bravado, but the words stuck in his throat. There was no way out of this, no way to erase the last few minutes. The man he'd seen as just another stranger, a target for his frustration and unchecked authority, was now the highest-ranking officer in his precinct. A superior. He was in deep trouble, and it was too late to backpedal. With a steady hand, Jordan reached into his suit jacket, this time slowly and deliberately, until he pulled out his badge and ID, holding them up just inches from Gary's face. The silver badge caught the light, practically glinting with the weight of Jordan's new position. "This," Jordan said quietly, his voice razor-sharp, "should make things very clear." Gary's face turned pale as he stared at the badge, the implications sinking in deeper and deeper. His mind spun, trying to claw its way out of the trap he'd walked right into. But there was no excuse, no clever spin to save him. All the power he thought he had, all the control, had evaporated the instant Jordan's identity was revealed. "Look, I didn't know," Gary stammered, his voice shaking slightly. I thought." Jordan's stare didn't waver. "Thought what, officer?" he asked, his tone as cold and unforgiving as a judge's gavel. "That a man walking down the street didn't deserve respect? That your badge gives you the right to treat people however you want?" Gary's mouth opened, but no words came out. Around them, people edged closer, their phones raised, some recording video, others snapping pictures. He could see the judgment in their eyes, feel the weight of their silent condemnation. "Officer Lewis," Jordan continued, his voice now loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "you assaulted a superior officer without cause. That alone is grounds for serious disciplinary action. But this wasn't just an assault, it was an abuse of your power. And I intend to hold you accountable." The air felt thick with tension, each word hitting Gary like a hammer. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple as he struggled to form a response. His reputation, his career, everything he had worked for was slipping away right in front of him. Jordan didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he calmly took out his phone and dialed the precinct's number. "Yes, this is Captain Mason," he said into the receiver, his voice steady and unhurried. "I need a squad down at Maple and 5th. There's been an incident involving Officer Lewis. Charges of assault will be filed." He paused, listening to the dispatcher's reply, then added, No injuries on my side, but I expect everything to be handled by the book." Gary felt a rush of cold dread as Jordan ended the call, slipping his phone back into his jacket. He could only stand there, feeling utterly powerless, knowing that every second that passed tightened the noose around his career. As the distant sound of sirens grew closer, a few pedestrians murmured words of support to Jordan. Some shook their heads in disgust at Gary. Others simply stared, taking in the sight of an officer of the law brought low by his own arrogance and prejudice. Gary felt their eyes burning into him, each look a reminder of his failure. Minutes later, 2 squad cars pulled up, their lights flashing. The officers who stepped out looked at the scene with confusion, their gazes flickering between the captain and their fellow officer. Sergeant Dana Perkins, a seasoned veteran with no tolerance for misconduct, stepped forward, her face a mask of professionalism as she assessed the situation. "Captain Mason," she greeted, her voice respectful. Her gaze shifted to Gary, brows furrowing in suspicion. "Sergeant," Jordan replied with a slight nod. "I'm pressing charges against Officer Lewis. He assaulted me without provocation." Dana's eyes widened, and she turned sharply to Gary, whose face was a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Is this true, Officer Lewis?" she asked. Her tone sharp. Gary opened his mouth, but all that came out was a strangled noise. He wanted to deny it, to explain it away, but he knew the truth was written all over his face and caught on the phones of every witness nearby. "Yes, Sergeant," Jordan answered for him, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "He didn't know who I was, and he thought that gave him a free pass to act however he pleased." Dana's face hardened as she processed the situation. She turned to her officers, nodding grimly. "Cuff him." The officers hesitated, looking at Gary, their fellow officer, a man they'd laughed with and shared countless shifts alongside. But there was no room for camaraderie here, no excuse for bending the rules. They stepped forward, their faces unreadable, and without a word, they secured the cuffs around Gary's wrists. As the cold metal snapped into place, Gary's world crumbled. Just minutes ago, he had felt powerful, invincible, confident in his authority. Now, that same authority was dragging him down, binding him in chains he'd forged through his own arrogance. He looked at Jordan one last time, his eyes wide with pleading, but Jordan's gaze remained steady and unwavering. Gary was escorted into the squad car, his head hanging low, his future as an officer slipping away with every step. As the squad car pulled away with Officer Gary Lewis in the back, the street was left in tense silence. The sun cast long shadows, and the crowd of onlookers lingered, buzzing with whispers of disbelief and shared nods of approval. Captain Jordan Mason watched the car until it disappeared around the corner, a cold intensity still lingering in his gaze. The air was thick with the weight of what had just transpired, and though he stood tall, Jordan felt the quiet anger simmering within him. Years of navigating the subtle and blatant prejudices of the job had trained him to keep his composure. But today, the line had been crossed, and this time, he had both the authority and the resolve to hold Gary accountable. Jordan turned to the bystanders, who were watching him with mixed expressions of admiration and quiet respect. A woman holding her phone lowered it, her eyes wide. "Thank you, Captain. Not all of us have the courage to stand up like that," she said softly. He gave her a brief nod, grateful but focused. There was still work to do. As the officers on the scene began dispersing the crowd, Jordan felt a presence behind him. He turned to see Sergeant Dana Perkins, her expression grave, her eyes a steady mix of curiosity and respect. "Captain Mason," she greeted him, a slight hesitation in her voice as she absorbed the reality of the situation. "I didn't expect to find you here, let alone in the middle of all this." Jordan's mouth tightened into a thin line, the memory of Gary's arrogance still fresh. "It was as unexpected for me as it was for you, Sergeant," he replied. "But I can't let behavior like that slide. Officer Lewis went too far, and I intend to follow this through to the end." Dana studied him, nodding slowly. She had been in the department long enough to know both its strengths and its hidden flaws. She had seen the subtle ways officers who crossed the line often avoided accountability, cloaked in the unspoken brotherhood that shielded them from consequence. But Jordan Mason wasn't just another officer, and she could see he wasn't going to be an easy man to sway. "Understood, sir," she replied firmly. "I'll make sure it's handled by the book. I assume you'll want full transparency?" "Exactly," Jordan said, meeting her gaze. "If we don't hold ourselves accountable, we undermine every oath we took when we put on this uniform." Around them, the officers who had seen the altercation began exchanging glances, the tension of the scene settling into a sense of quiet apprehension. Gary had been one of their own, someone they had worked alongside. But Captain Mason was a new force, a man whose principles were visibly unshakable. The shift in dynamics was palpable, like the weight of a storm hovering just out of sight. Dana took a breath, visibly choosing her next words carefully. "With respect, Captain, you're sending a message. People will talk. You know as well as I do that not everyone here wants the same changes. Jordan's gaze didn't falter. He had faced far worse than whispers, and he had never been one to back down from what he believed was right. They'll have to adapt, he said simply. We're here to serve the people. Dana, all of the people. The unspoken message in his words was clear, and Dana gave him a nod of quiet approval. She respected strength when she saw it. And today, she had seen more than she'd expected from her new captain. Moments later, another squad car pulled up, carrying Lieutenant Brooks, a middle-aged man with sharp features and a reputation for keeping to himself. He approached, his gaze sweeping the scene, lingering on Jordan for a moment longer than necessary. Brooks was known for being a quiet presence, often avoiding entanglements, and he gave off the air of someone watching carefully from the sidelines. Captain Mason, Brooks said, his voice neutral but his expression guarded. I heard what happened. Word spreads quickly. Jordan nodded, his stance calm but unyielding. I'm sure it does, he replied, reading Brooks's reaction, understanding that this would be one of many exchanges like this. I intend for this to be a public matter. Transparency, accountability, it's what the department needs. Brooks's expression barely flickered, but his silence spoke volumes. Well, if there's anything I can do, let me know. Jordan inclined his head, watching as Brooks moved back toward the other officers. His loyalty ambiguous. Jordan knew Brooks would be keeping a close eye on how things unfolded, and, more importantly, on the changes Jordan intended to bring to the precinct. As the last few officers gathered up their things, Jordan took a final look around Maple Street, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. Today had been more than just a confrontation. It had been a statement, a line drawn. There would be no more business as usual, not under his command. Dana approached him one last time. Captain, would you like me to file the preliminary report? Or would you prefer to handle it yourself? I trust you, Sergeant. Just make sure the details are thorough. Jordan replied, his voice softening slightly. And let's not keep anything under wraps. Dana nodded, her face set with purpose. Consider it done. As the remaining officers dispersed and the crowd finally began to thin, Jordan let out a slow breath. The hardest battles were often the ones that began in silence, the quiet resistance that tested one's resolve. Today, he had made a choice to stand, and he knew there would be more days like this ahead. The drive to the station was a blur for Gary Lewis. The cold metal cuffs around his wrists were tight, a constant reminder of his loss of control, his collapse of authority. He had never sat in the back of a squad car before, never imagined himself here, especially not because of a single moment of misplaced rage. He replayed the encounter with Captain Mason over and over, each detail twisting like a knife. How could he have let his temper cost him so much? As they pulled into the station, Gary's heart pounded with a mix of fear and disbelief. He was led inside. His colleagues, fellow officers he'd known for years, stealing glances at him, their eyes filled with surprise, judgment, even a touch of pity. But none of them approached him, and he could feel the distance growing with every step he took toward the holding area. Once he was processed and allowed to sit in a quiet room, the weight of his actions finally settled on him. The stark, dim light overhead cast a pale glow across the room, deepening the shadows that seemed to swallow him whole. The reality he'd been trying to avoid hit him with full force. He could already picture the newspaper headlines, the whispers spreading through every department in the city, his family's disappointment. The captain had made it clear. There would be no escape, no cover-up, and no mercy. Just then, the door opened, and Sergeant Dana Perkins stepped inside, her expression unreadable. She held a folder under her arm, her eyes scanning Gary briefly before she spoke. Captain Mason has formalized the charges. Assault on a superior officer. Abuse of power. Is not looking good. Gary. Her words were like a punch to his gut, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. He had hoped she might say something different. offer some small glimmer of leniency. But there was nothing in her tone that hinted at forgiveness. He swallowed, the taste of regret bitter on his tongue. Dana, I didn't know he was the captain. I thought. That doesn't change what you did, she interrupted, her voice firm. You assaulted a man without cause. It doesn't matter who he is. Gary, you should know better. He felt his shoulders slump, the weight of his actions pressing down like lead. He had thought he'd had power, thought he could get away with anything as long as he wore that badge. But now, stripped of authority, he saw himself clearly for the first time in years, and he didn't like what he saw. Dana softened her gaze slightly, crossing her arms as she looked down at him. Look, Gary, you had a reputation for being intense, but I never thought it would come to this. You've put yourself in a position I can't defend. No one can. Gary's jaw tightened as he fought to keep his voice steady. Is there any chance of making this right? He asked, barely above a whisper. Dana let out a slow breath, glancing at the door before answering. Captain Mason isn't going to let this slide. And, honestly, he shouldn't. You crossed a line. Gary, a line that no one should ever cross. Now you have to live with the consequences. The silence between them stretched, each second heavy with the unspoken finality of her words. This wasn't just the end of his career. It was the beginning of a reckoning he hadn't anticipated, a stripping away of every illusion he'd built around his authority. As Dana turned to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at him one last time. You'll be escorted to a formal hearing tomorrow. You can explain your side then. But understand this. There's no going back to how things were. Gary watched as she left, his mind racing, trying to grasp at a solution that didn't exist. He wanted to scream, to blame someone, anyone, for his downfall, but deep down, he knew there was no one else to blame. A cold, empty feeling settled in his chest. This wasn't the story he'd told himself when he first put on the uniform, when he had sworn to uphold justice and protect others. He had strayed so far from that promise. He barely recognized himself anymore. The authority he had wielded like a weapon was now the very force that had destroyed him. As he sat alone in the stark, unforgiving room, he thought of Captain Mason, how he had stood there, calm and unyielding, refusing to let Gary's abuse of power go unchecked. It struck him, for the first time, that maybe Mason wasn't just his superior in rank. Maybe Mason was everything he'd once hoped to be. A man who held power with respect. A man who would face down corruption rather than allow it to flourish. For the first time in years, Gary felt small. The uniform that had once filled him with pride now felt like a heavy chain, binding him to the mistakes he'd made, the paths he could never undo. Word spread quickly. By the following morning, headlines buzzed with the story of an officer's unprovoked assault on the new precinct captain. News outlets and social media exploded with clips captured by the bystanders on Maple Street. And the incident had already become the talk of the town. For many, this was just another example of unchecked power meeting accountability, but for Gary Lewis, it was the complete unraveling of his life. Sitting alone in the station's holding cell, Gary could feel the weight of every whispered word, every judgment cast from behind the bars. His colleagues were talking. He knew that much. They whispered in hallways, avoided his eyes, and he could sense the betrayal hanging in the air. It was as if he had suddenly become invisible, erased from the force he had once taken pride in. Yet the silence was nothing compared to the flood of anger and regret that surged within him, knowing that he'd brought this on himself. Outside, the precinct was tense. Officers worked under the sharp eye of Captain Mason, who walked through the station with an air of quiet authority. He didn't need to speak loudly or assert himself. His presence alone was enough to command respect. Officers who had once ignored misconduct found themselves under scrutiny, their every action measured against a new standard. Mason was making it clear there would be no tolerance for abuse of power in his precinct. As Mason moved from office to office, he spoke to his team with a calm but firm resolve. In every conversation, he reminded them of their duty, of the trust they were meant to uphold for the community they served. And his words had an effect. Officers who once turned a blind eye to smaller offenses now hesitated. A newfound respect and vigilance taking root. The precinct was beginning to change, and those changes rippled through the department like a stone dropped in still water. Meanwhile, the public's response was overwhelming. The video of Gary's assault on Captain Mason went viral, sparking debates across the city and beyond. People from all walks of life weighed in, some outraged that such behavior could occur in their city, others relieved to see someone finally hold the system accountable. Community leaders, activists, and residents gathered outside the precinct, their voices calling for more than just punishment. They demanded transparency, reform, and a commitment to justice. Inside his office, Captain Mason prepared a statement for the press. He knew the power of this moment, knew it wasn't just about holding one officer accountable but about setting a precedent. He wanted to address the community's anger and fear, to show them that the department was capable of change. His assistant knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "They're ready for you, Captain," she said, her tone respectful yet firm. He nodded, taking a moment to steady himself. This wasn't just another public address. This was a chance to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, to build trust where there had been only suspicion. As he stepped out into the hallway, Mason caught sight of Sergeant Dana Perkins, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. They had been through a lot in the past few days, and her support had been steady, unwavering. Together, they walked toward the press conference area, where a crowd of journalists and community members waited, their eyes full of expectation. Mason took his place behind the podium, the murmurs of the crowd falling silent as he began to speak. "Good afternoon," he started, his voice calm yet powerful. "As many of you know, an incident occurred involving Officer Gary Lewis, a member of this department, and myself. This incident was captured on video and shared widely, and I want to take a moment to address it directly, both as your captain and as a member of this community." He paused, letting his words sink in, the weight of his responsibility pressing on him. "What happened on Maple Street is unacceptable," he continued. "It's a reminder that our badge is not a shield for abusive behavior but a symbol of trust. Every officer in this precinct took an oath to protect and serve. And when that oath is broken, it is our duty to hold each other accountable." The crowd nodded, some even clapping softly in agreement. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, and the cameras focused tightly on his face, capturing his every word. "I want to assure the community that Officer Lewis will be held accountable," Mason stated firmly. "And more importantly, we are taking steps to ensure incidents like this do not happen again. This precinct will be a place of integrity, respect, and fairness, where every officer understands that their power comes with responsibility." From the back of the room, a hand shot up. A young journalist, her eyes bright with urgency, asked, "Captain Mason, do you think this incident will lead to wider reform within the department?" Mason looked directly at her, his expression thoughtful but determined. "I hope so," he answered. "But real change doesn't happen from one incident alone. It requires ongoing commitment from me, from every officer here, and from the community that holds us accountable. This incident may have sparked the conversation, but the responsibility is on all of us to continue it." The room erupted into applause, the tension melting into a rare moment of solidarity. For the first time in years, it felt as if a real bridge was being built between the police force and the community it served. As the press conference concluded, Mason stepped away from the podium, nodding respectfully to the crowd as he made his way back inside the precinct. Dana joined him, falling into step beside him with a slight smile. "You did good out there," she remarked, her tone carrying a rare warmth. "People are listening." Mason nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling in. "It's just the beginning," he replied. "There's a lot of work to do, but if today taught us anything, it's that change is possible." In his cell, Gary Lewis sat alone, the distant sound of applause reaching him like a dull echo, a reminder of everything he had lost. For the first time, he understood the true weight of his actions, not just for himself, but for the people he had sworn to protect.